Today, we are going to be talking about an inconvenient truth. And no, it's not global warming. It's something else. So let's start with something fuzzy and nice. Have you ever, when you were kids, have you ever took your parents' stuff and pretend that you're an adult? Have you ever taken their clothes and walking around, or shoes or anything like that? I remember my sister. She got such spanking. That was awesome. She broke mom's high heel shoe, and yeah, good memories. At least mine. But probably the most hilarious thing that I remember as a kid, I was a teenager. And my aunt and uncle, they didn't have any kids. And after about, I think they were married for 15 years, they decided to adopt a girl. And they got a little girl. She was like a year and a half old. And my aunt, I love her to death, but she is not that great with kids. She is like not that great with kids. My uncle, on the other hand, he was amazing. He was like a second dad to me. He taught me a whole bunch of stuff. And he was really good with raising Maria. That's her name. And one Friday afternoon, my sister and I were over at their place. We would always pretty much spend weekends at aunts and uncle's place. And we were talking about church, because church is tomorrow. And she was probably 3 years old or so, because I remember that she was walking and she was talking. So she's like, I'm going to go get ready for church. And she walks out. She just walks out to the living room and she goes. So we keep talking and she walks in and she has a tie around her neck and she has her dad's shoes. And she's flopping in the room. And then, of course, the whole session of explaining her, no, you have to, and all of the fussing from her, no, I want to wear this. She wanted to be a dad. That was her thing. And now she's a grown woman, she's married, she has a young boy, and it's just funny. Anytime we talk, we kind of recall that moment. But a couple of years back, we were talking as a family, and we were just, like, this is the question that arose. So what? Why would she have to why wouldn't she wear her dad's shoes? Why wouldn't she wear a tie? What's that much of a big deal? And then, the thought that comes to your mind, think about it. Everything we do, the way we are dressed right now, the way we act, the way we approach people, even the way we got up this morning, everything is prescribed. None of that stuff happens, well, because, I just do it that way. Well, yes, you do it that way, but it was prescribed to you to do it that way. Society tells us this is the way that is appropriate for you to act. Now, some societies have a little bit broader spectrum of what is okay, what is not okay. Like, for example, here in our country, essentially you can do whatever you want. As long as you're not really offending somebody, don't walk into swimming shorts into the church. But nobody's going to tell you, hey, dress this way or dress that way. Nevertheless, the society still does tell us that. For example, many of you have a dress code at work, right? You can't just show up. If you're an accountant, you're working in a law company, you're not going to walk in jeans and flip-flops, right? It ends up being pretty detrimental to your career. Like next time, tomorrow, you walk decent or don't walk in anymore. But what's the big deal? I'm dressed. Well, yeah, but you're not dressed appropriately. So, there are things that we do in life, majority of them, that we are conditioned to do because we are told that is the way to be done. Now, Jesus, in the story that we're going to read today, is talking about the same problem. And the answer that he gives is actually very disturbing to many Christians. And even when we read, and we're going to study this today, and you're going to see what he's talking about, a lot of people would just dismiss what Jesus has to say and move on with doing things the way they want to do them because they don't like the message that Jesus has for us today. I really hope that you will like the message because it is the message from God. Because here's the thing. God never changes, right? We can agree on that. God does not waver. He is not going to change his mind. He is not going to evolve into something better. He is already the definition of good. So, whatever God puts before us, okay, these are the things that I want you to do, they're set in stone. And these are the things that are not changing. But then, on the other hand, there is a lot of things that people tell us, this is the way you should do. And those things, yes, if I'm courteous, if I'm respectful, if I'm appreciative, I'm going to abide by those rules too. But, hey, if I want to wear high heels, I'm going to wear high heels. And there is nothing nobody can do about that, except my wife. You see, there are some things that are as fearful as presence of God. Now, Matthew chapter 9, verse 14. You guys can read it in your Bibles. We'll have on the screen ESV translation, so whichever you guys prefer. But let's read and let's see what is going on here. Then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" What's the big deal about fasting? Fasting at a time, and pretty much even today, is a spiritual exercise. And at that time, it was expected from anybody who wanted to be engaged in any kind of spiritual work. So in this case, if you were a follower of a rabbi, and your rabbi fasts, as he will 100%, he would, you have to do that too. The purpose of fasting was always, and if you read the Old Testament, you will see that on a very deep level, the purpose of fasting was always reconnecting to God. Now, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I hope that, so like with raising hands and stuff like that, I hope that you guys fast, at least occasionally. First thing, it's very healthy. It's healthy for your body, it's healthy for your mind, but then also, it's very healthy for our spiritual lives. The idea is, I will deny myself anything, even the basic things that will distract my mind from focusing on God. That's the idea of fasting. Today, and that was the idea of that time, but also at that time it was a cultural thing. You remember Jesus' story about fasting. He's giving a lesson. If you fast, you better make sure that nobody knows that. Clean up your face. Don't be all like a warmed up corpse so everybody can see what's going on. You make sure that people don't know. Jesus is giving that lesson as a common thing because fasting was a common thing of his time. So, over here, now we have a specific group of people. What does it say? Then the disciples of John came to Jesus. Now, interesting fact about disciples of John, addressing Jesus. They were not the ones who would oppose him. What would Pharisees do? You remember Pharisees. They come to Jesus. What do? They come, "Hey, Jesus, what do you think about tax to the emperor?" And now they're waiting to see what is he going to say so they could accuse him, they could discredit him, they could point a finger and say, "This man is a fraud. You people should not follow this man, he is a fraud." So all of the questions that Pharisees had for Jesus were like that. They were like tricky things that Jesus can slip on. On the other hand, we have disciples of John. They were not those guys. They did not dislike Jesus. On contrary, John the Baptist himself, do you remember what did he say about Jesus? You guys remember what he say? He is supposed to be lifted up. And I'm supposed to be shrinking. He said at the River Jordan, you remember, Lamb of God. And John's disciples were there and they heard those words. They heard that John the Baptist specifically said, I am not the Messiah, but the one that comes after me, that's the guy. And then he points to Jesus. So you have disciples of John kinda in between. You have Pharisees over there, you have Jesus over there, and they're standing in between. And they're like, what in the world is this Messiah doing? And you know what was Jesus doing? Last week when Pastor Gordon preached about that, who remembers? Let's see. This is kind of the hardest thing to ask a congregation. What was the sermon about last week? Best silence ever. Last week, Pastor Gordon was preaching about Jesus calling Matthew to be his disciple. Now, that happened in the morning. Let's imagine it that way. In the morning, Jesus is walking down the street. There is a tax collector's booth. And Matthew is over there counting the coins. And Jesus looks at him, follow me. Matthew knew who Jesus was. Matthew heard, everybody knew who Jesus was. The moment Matthew heard those words, follow me, he left everything. He just tossed those coins. He left his booth and he went to follow Jesus. Matthew was thrilled to be a disciple of a teacher. I would assume it was his dream, but he never made a cut. No rabbi wanted him, so he decided to make money a different way. Matthew was so thrilled. Guess what he does? He throws a party. He throws a party for Jesus. Now, this was not like a ballroom party, like, you know, the Baroque music and the silverware and the nice chandeliers. No, this was like a that's the party that Matthew threw. Hey, there was booze, there was foods, because who were Matthew's friends? A tax collector's friends. Other tax collectors, other disreputable people, shady figures, probably ladies with suspicious character and short skirt, probably guys with dark shades sitting in the corner with a puff, occasional puff to keep them going. But that was Matthew's crowd. Now Matthew is so proud that he invites all of his crowd to his place, and he invites Jesus to tell everybody, hey, Jesus called me to be his disciple. And now you're approaching Matthew's house, and it's a pooh, 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 pooh. You see that this crowd, the lawn is filled with beer cans, people are screaming from the second floor, and Jesus is coming with his disciples, and I put myself in shoes of Peter and Andrew and John. They're like, do we really want to get in there? Because on the other side of the street, there are Pharisees with signs protesting. Like, Jesus fake, Jesus fake, Jesus fake. And his disciples are like, what do we do? But Jesus is like already there. Hey Matthew, high five, how are you doing? Oh, this is your cousin, give me a hug. Jesus is already in there. He's already partying with the people. And then Peter is like, well, guys, come on, let's go. Yeah, let's go. So they get in there. You have Pharisees on the other side of the street with signs. And then on the pedestrian walk, you have these guys, the disciples of John. They know that Jesus is the Messiah. They know that he was accredited by their own rabbi that is sitting in prison right now because of this guy. But he's doing all of the wrong things. He's just breaking and shattering everything we know about society, everything we know about decent rules of social conduct. He's screwing up things for himself and for us. And they are standing over there. Matthew's house is right there with Jesus in there and the party. Pharisees are over there. And they look at their national leaders who they trust and believe, who don't support Jesus. And then they look at the one they know is Messiah. And they're like, why do we and the Pharisees stand out here and you and your disciples are over there? And they're asking that from the sincerity of their hearts. They really want to know. They're not trying to bash Jesus. They don't want to trip him. They really want to know. So what does Jesus tell them? Verse 15. And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken from them, and then they will fast. There is a ton of things that Jesus said right here, right now. One assumption was that the party that Matthew invited Jesus to was actually a wedding party, wedding celebration. So that's why Jesus is taking this example of a bridegroom and the people who are celebrating. But several times in the New Testament, one thing that we can see is that the terminology bridegroom is used for the Son of Man. And the terminology bride refers to his church or to the New Jerusalem. So when Jesus is using this wording the way it is, it will resonate with the people who would listen to his teaching, because they heard his teaching before, and he was repeating his stories all the time. So it wasn't like he said this story one time and he never said it again. So the people who heard him say this, they're like, okay. I mean, this makes sense, of course. If the bridegroom is there with the wedding celebration, everybody's going to celebrate. When the bridegroom is gone, or actually how he says over here, taken away, yes. I didn't witness this because I was too young, but I remember the story that once the police literally came to a wedding party and arrested the groom and took him. I know the guy. I remember his face. He's probably 15 years older than me. But his family never wanted to admit that happened. No, that didn't happen. No, he was just worn out. He had to go and lay down, and then in the morning he miraculously showed up again. But imagine the situation where the bridegroom was just picked up by the police and taken in the middle of the celebration party. There is nothing to celebrate anymore. What is Jesus talking about here? So, again, let's combine these metaphors with the actions. The bridegroom is Jesus. He is God himself. And he is present right over there, right now. Now, what was fasting all about? The purpose of fasting was to get closer to God. Now, put yourselves in shoes of John's disciples. They were right there, talking to God face to face. They were as close to God as you can be. And they are discussing methods. What should we do to get close to God? What do you say, Jesus? What should we do? What should we do? That's exactly what it was. God was right there in their face. And they were talking about their little box of how things should be done to get close to God. That's why Jesus is telling them that. Jesus is not dismissing fasting. Oh no. He is just telling them, right here, right now, it's not time to fast. Because fasting is not going to get you closer to God than you are close to God right now. But when he left, when he was taken away from them to the heavens, what was the church doing? Breaking bread, fasting, and studying the Bible. The fast has its place if it's used right. But if the fast becomes the only thing important, this is the way we do things. Have you ever heard that in a church? This is the way things should be done. This is the way we do things. It's the worst one. This is what the Bible says, and the Bible doesn't say that. But it's very easy for us to do that when it comes to practicing our faith. When it comes to doing things that matter in our beliefs, it's very easy to, okay, yeah, that's the way you should do it, without questioning it. This is how you're going to get close to God. But then, weird things happen, where things get out of your box, and you see the Spirit working. And that's why John's disciples were confused. They were stuck in their little box of behavior that is supposed to keep them close to God, without realizing that they actually captivated themselves the same way that we keep our kids in our children's church. We don't do that, I'm kidding. Nobody laughs. Oh my goodness! We should get some CBD oil for everybody. You make me feel like nobody's listening to me. That's kind of the worst part. That's the worst thing that a pastor can experience. Like, I don't see, these lights are really bright, and I don't see much, and I kind of hope that people are listening to me. So, give me a sign. Okay, let's keep on reading. Verse 16. Now Jesus gives two stories. Two examples of how things should be done and should not be done that completely shatter everything that these guys believed in. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Some time ago, we had this discussion with the teenagers, and the major question was, why would you patch clothes? Just get another one. Why would you even bother to patch clothes? And yeah, we live in a world where things get recycled real easy, and it's not that expensive to buy a new piece of clothes, and we just never patch them. Nobody even knows what needle and a thread can do. I remember when, again, I go back a lot to the 90s, because in my country there was a war at that time, and it was a completely different, it was time of poverty, time of having to do everything by yourself and save everything. So I remember patching my own socks. It was just one of those things that were normal, that you couldn't really, if you wanted to have socks, you better patch them, because we can't buy any until next month. It was kind of like that. Today, we don't live in that world. So, relation to patching maybe makes no sense. But, there is something that I'm sure every one of us can relate to. Have you ever taken your favorite shirt, washed it, and then by a mistake tossed it in a dryer on high? And then you put it on and like, did I just gain 20 pounds overnight? What's going on? And then there are different methods to stretch it, put it back in place, or just keep your stomach in, and it's going to look fine. I look like a teenager. Most likely, unless you really lose 20 pounds overnight, that shirt is going away, because it shrunk, it's screwed up, it's destroyed. There is nothing that you can do about that. What Jesus is talking about over here is a similar thing. So at that time, they were making their own clothes. You couldn't go to, there was no Hebrew Macy's that you can just walk in and get stuff. You had to make your own. And of course, they had traders who would make clothes, and then people would trade stuff, but essentially everything was homemade. Now this is what happens. You wear your clothes until it completely wears out. until it falls apart. So the clothes would tear. And you would wash your clothes, and especially with the hygiene laws that God gave to Jews, they would wash their clothes quite frequently. So what would happen after a while, an old piece of clothes would shrink to the size, whatever it is, and it would stay there. If you get a hole on that piece of clothes, and you take a new piece of cloth and patch it in, toss it into a dryer on high, the garment, the shirt would not shrink, it would stay the same, but the patch of new piece of material would shrink. And it would rip out all of the thread, it would make hole to be even bigger. That was the point that Jesus was trying to make. That's what, and people knew that. The moment he said that story, people were like, yeah, I know it happened to me. Just like the dryer thing. A lot of people related. Now, in the same way, Jesus is trying to make even stronger point, but by sharing another example. And he didn't do this very often. He goes to verse 17. Let's read the verse 17 together. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved. Now, any winemakers around here? So I thought, even if you did, you wouldn't admit it. Okay, any wine drinkers around here? Never mind. So, my dad, he is a winemaker, an amateur winemaker, but still winemaker nonetheless. Where I grew up in Europe, especially in that part of country, of Serbia, it's very common that every single house, we don't have a backyard the way usually Americans have with a lawn. The backyard will be split in half. You have one backyard that is for people, so gazebo and chairs and whatever you want to put there. But the second backyard is going to be for the garden and for the pets. Actually, dogs over there were not pets. Dogs over there are like watchdogs. They serve a purpose. But we had chickens, we had goats and stuff like that, but all of that stuff is in the back. We had a huge garden. Actually, we still have it. My dad is still there. And the garden had a huge vineyard, like going lengthwise and then on the side. I remember that as a kid, I loved it. You just go in there and grapes, different grapes, all kinds of grapes. Oh my goodness. And he wouldn't really make much wine. He would make a couple of gallons of wine from the harvest. But still, he loved it because it was his own, and then it's a nice gift to give somebody homemade wine. And when we became Adventists, he stopped making fermented wine. He started making the grape juice. He would pretty much squeeze the juice with the press, and then he would fill it in the plastic, like those 2-liter big plastic bottles, and he would put it in the freezer the same day. So usually on like Friday night, he would take one out just to thaw overnight. And then for lunch on Sabbath, we would have a fresh grape juice. That stuff is good. Like if you guys never tried fresh grape juice, that's good. You take maybe like 6 ounces and it's fine. You take more than that, like when the sugar rush kicks in. It's like, I gotta climb that tree. I gotta climb that tree right now. Seriously, it's awesome. So one time I was helping my dad. It wasn't a matter of choice, it was mandatory. Come on, you have to help me. He was squeezing the juice with the press and I was filling the bottles. And he told me, leave 2 fingers on the top. And as any other teenager, I wasn't paying attention what he was telling me. And probably even if I did, I wouldn't. But anyways, I just filled them to the brim. Like he said, okay, cap it in, and then when we had all of those, he wasn't paying attention, I was just doing it, and then I took it to the freezer and put it in the freezer. So, next day, luckily, I was the first one to open that freezer. Mom and Dad went to work, and of course, there was grape juice everywhere. So like, freaking out, I take all of the bottles out, I clean up as much as I could, and it took me a while. I'm not, as a teenager, I wasn't that kind of well-versed when it comes to cleaning. But anyways, it took me some time to clean. In the meantime, all of those balls were out, and unbeknownst to me, things happen to a grape juice when it's out like that. Long story short, a couple of weeks later, we had a communion service, and it was a cheerful gathering. And you can see two types of people. One would take the cup, they're like, ugh. And the other one would take the cup like, ooh. So that was an interesting revelation to me and a good painful lesson afterwards. But that is exactly what Jesus is talking about over here. In his time, there were two ways to preserve wine. It was the expensive way and the cheap way. Expensive way was to use the wine skins. Now what the wine skins are? They're actually a stomach of a goat or of a sheep. Because that is the only organ that is completely closed off and that is spill proof. Actually liquid proof, let's put it that way. Whatever you pour in is going to stay in. It's not porous to the point to start leaking. And they didn't have at that time ability to kind of combine different types of materials. So this was the best solution they had, but it was very expensive. So the cheap way was to just cook wine until it boils down to a mush, to like a jelly, and then they would save it like that, and then when they need wine, they would just take it out and they would mix it with water, let it sit overnight, it starts fermenting, and it does the job. So that's why Jesus had that example for the wedding in Cana when the bridegroom came and he said, everybody gets the good wine first and then the bad wine later when everybody gets drunk. And that is what they did. So when you had a wedding, you would have a batch of wineskin wine and you would have another batch of a cheap cooked down wine. So the wine skins, they had to be fresh. They had to be unused when the wine is poured in. Because what happens? When you pour the wine in and you cap it off, the fermentation creates gases that start expanding. And the fresh wine skin is flexible and it expands with those gases. So that's the way they know when the wine is ready. Like, tick, tick, tick. When you knock it and it's like a watermelon, you know, okay, this is going to be a good one. If it's kind of flabby, no, let it sit a little bit more. But that's pretty much the way they would do it. Now, if somebody wanted to take the cheap way out, and there was always somebody who tried to do that, they would take the old wine skins and pour the new wine in. What happens at that point? Those old wine skins, they're set. They have no more room to expand. So as the wine expands, either the cap is going to pop off or the skins are going to burst. And that's what Jesus is referring to when he's telling them that story. But now, the question here is, why is he taking this example and what is he trying to put in it? What are these examples? What do they have to do with fasting, with Matthew's party, with all of these things that are happening? What do they have to do with it? Let's look at this verse in Isaiah chapter 43. This verse is an amazing message from our God. Remember not the former things, not consider the things of old, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? This is one of the prophecies related to the Messiah. But the amazing part of it, Jesus is calling forth upon these verses. He is calling disciples of John to step out of their box, to step out of their Jewish traditional shoes, to step away from those Pharisees telling them what to do, and to immerse themselves into a new world. Yes, it will be different, but God's law is still set in stone. His law is not going to change. Human laws, they change. That's what he did over here. That's why he said, you can take something that is old, combine it with new. Actually, the other way around. You can take something that is new and fresh, and then try to work with it with the old methods. Why is this message so important to me? I've been working as a youth pastor for a long time, and still on occasions I have to deal with teenagers. I'm not too happy about it, but occasionally I do have to. One thing that I realize is I would tell to myself, I'm too old for these kids. But interesting thing that happens is the teachers who are teaching the youth, they are in their late 20s, so maybe like a decade ahead of the teenagers. They come and tell me, I am too old for this kid. like seriously? What? This is what is happening. And this is why this message of Jesus plays a huge, huge directional point in our lives. We are called to preach the gospel to everybody. To our parents, to our siblings, to our kids, to our grandkids. We are called to look around and see, who can I say, what did Jesus do for me? That is what Jesus told us. Go over there and make sure that everybody knows what I did for you. That is preaching the gospel. That is the good news. But here's the problem. Until the 20th century, historically speaking, the world didn't change much. Think about the history. Remember the history. Lives were lived from generation to generation pretty much very, very similarly, almost completely identical. And then the 20th century brought the change. Actually, the World War II was the breaking point. Then things started changing like crazy. We have, right here, we have baby boomers, we have X generation, we have millennials, and we have Z generation in this room. That is 4 generations, 4 different generations of people. If we were in the 19th century, there wouldn't be much difference between these 4 generations. Right now, right here, there is like eons of distance between the generations. Look, baby boomers, it's all their fault. It's all your fault. You started it. You, the hippies, children of the flowers. You wanted to rebel. You got up and said no to how things were done by that time. And then you made a chaos with your parents who just came out of the World War II, who were trying to restructure the world, and you baby boomers told them, no, we're going to do it differently. And then your kids, the X generation, were the confused ones. That is like the 60s and the 70s raised kids. Yeah, that's they didn't know. Why are my parents and grandparents fighting? Why do they hate each other? What am I supposed to do with my life? Statistically speaking, next generation is the least decided one. On general issues like the political affiliation or religious, or they're kind of the most confused one. Then you have the millennials. And millennials are the quantum leap away from the X generation. And that is because of the dawn of the internet and the electronic revolution that we witnessed in the 90s and then in the 2000s. Because that made millennials much more connected, much more informed, and much more influential than any generation before them. And then you have little robots running around, the Z generation. that you can't detach them from their devices. They can't imagine a life without electronics, without the accessibility to electronic devices. Their reality is completely different than X generation. X generation still, you saw those Facebook memes. Like, are you in the generation that grew up on the streets and they had to go home when the lights went on? Well, Z generation doesn't know what does that mean, because lights never go out for them. The whole point is, we live in a very diverse world that we didn't choose. But this world of ours, it's very different. If we sat down and talked about one thing, you would get 4 different answers from these 4 generations that are not going to be, that are more going to be different than similar. Whether it's politics, whether it's food, whether it's ecology, whether it's any of that stuff. And now, how do you preach the gospel in this? Can you preach the gospel to your grandkid in the same way that gospel was preached to you? No way. Or vice versa. Can you go to your grandpa, give him an iPad, and tell him, hey, this is an awesome app for you to read the Bible? He's gonna, what's this for? Where did it go? Where did it go? What's going on? You, my friends, are called to preach the gospel. Not to preach the church. Not to preach, this is how we do it. You, my friends, are called to preach, this is what God did for me. This is how He made my life a gospel, a cheerful news, a happy message. That is what we are supposed to do. But you can't do it the same old way. And it's up to your creativity and up to your prayers to be able to fulfill that message. Do you look at your family and you wish, oh, if only so-and-so would understand God, if he or she was closer to God. They're so busy with school, with golf, with work, with they go to the gym more than they go to church. Is there anybody in your life that you're looking at wishing they were closer to Jesus? Well, don't just pray for them, but pray for yourself, that God opens your eyes to see what does the new wineskin look like. You can't walk up to them with an old shirt. You can't come to them with an old wineskin. You can't go to them and tell them you have to fast in order for you to meet God. No. You have to understand what is in their minds. This, I'm not talking just about the older people understanding the younger people. No, it's the other way around. It applies to you guys and needle and the thread. We have to preach the gospel. You can't go home today and spend a week with nobody knowing what God did for you. If you did that, you wasted a week. And frankly, I'm wondering if your spiritual life is life or a defibrillator. So I challenge you today, as you walk home, long weekend, a lot of you are going to be with the family. That's why we're missing a lot of people. A lot of you are going to be out there with people. Ask the Lord, what are the new wineskins for me in my life? What are the new wineskins for my grandkid? What are the new wineskins for my uncle? Lord, what do I do? How do I, not, sorry, my bad. Lord, how do I do it? He wants us to do it, and He will make it happen. If we are ready to step out of our box of this is how we do things and try something new. It might be weird, it might feel awkward, but it will be blessed. So I pray for you, and I will pray for you after our last song, for all of us, for God to give us the wisdom to find those new wineskins in our life. Amen.